I'd like to introduce Keith Berns. He is the owner, co-owner, and operator of Green Cover Seed in Nebraska, and also just a wonderful partner of Ecdysis Foundation. Been so happy to have him along with us as we promote cover crops and yeah, and all the tools that you have, right? I mean, I think that's what's amazing. And the tools that Keith Berns offers on their website are free for you to use. And that way you can figure out what you need for cover crop mixes. But yeah, I thought he would be perfect to talk about plants and plant diversity. So Keith, you want to tell us a little bit more about yourself and
Sure.
introduce
Yeah.
our
Thank
plant?
you.
Yeah.
So, yeah, my brother and I grew up on the farm. We're in South Central Nebraska. We are living on the farm that we grew up on. And after graduating from the University of Nebraska, I had an ag ed degree. I taught school for 10 years. And then my dad was getting ready to retire. So I came back to the farm in 1998. And at that point, my brother had already been farming with my dad for a while. He was getting pretty involved in the no-till uh, movement and the no-till organizations. And so when we came back, we pretty well switched everything over to no-till. And through that, we had great experiences with no-till on the plains, got to meet all the cool people, the Gabe Browns and the Jay Feuers and the Gail Fullers. We got to meet all those people before we ever even thought about green cover. But it was at that event, at the No Till on the Plains event, where we kind of got introduced to the concept of diverse cover crop mixes. And it's a cool story because the guy that really brought that over here to the US, his name's Adamir Caligari. He was just here like last week and got to spend time with him. He came to visit our farm and that was really fun to be able to do that because he really inspired a lot of the things that are going on right now, certainly a lot of what we're doing at Green Cover. And the thing that, so we started Green Cover in 2009. And based on what Adamir had said, some experiments that Gabe Brown and Jay Fuhrer had done, experiments that we had done, we knew that the only way that cover crops were going to work, especially in drier areas, the only way they really work is with diverse mixes. And we just have seen the moisture efficiency of a diverse mix so much better than anything grown in monoculture. The benefits to the soil accrue so much faster with diversity. And so I think that's a great lead in both to what Ecdysis is doing because as the Thousand Farm Initiative has shown and has proven over and over again that power of diversity. And it's not just the plant diversity. That plant diversity leads to the biological diversity, which leads to the insect diversity and the bird diversity and wildlife. It's all tied together, as you know. But it really does, we feel like it really does have to start with the plants. And that's where the cover crops really come in because for many of us, it's going to be difficult to grow 8, 10, 12 different types of cash crops. But you can, but that's very, very difficult to do. But it's very easy to do that with your cover crop mix. When you time it right, when you do it right, you can add tremendous amounts of diversity with relatively low amounts of work or effort through the cover crop. And so that's what we do. That's what we promote. That's what we help people with, help people design the cover crop mix that is going to bring the most diversity as possible that matches the context that they're dealing with. Because that's going to be different for each person. And so our whole business has been set up around making diverse mixes that fit the context of the individual operation. And the little video clip that we're going to watch today to kind of get us started, Lynette and I were just talking about this, is Dr. Christine Jones from Australia, one of our absolute most favorite people, probably one of the smartest people that we've ever met, and also is such a good communicator. She's a scientist, so she knows all this information, but unlike a lot of scientists that can't communicate that very well, now John Lundgren, of course, is an exception. He's a great communicator. But so is Dr. Jones, and we just have had the privilege of having her at our farm multiple times, and by far on our we have almost 500 videos on our YouTube channel now, but the four most popular ones, all four of them are Dr. Jones. Christine Jones, we had her do a webinar series. I think it was actually during the COVID year when nobody could really travel. Nobody was really, able to get out. And so we were able to get her to do a four-part webinar series. And this one that we're going to watch a clip on today is called The Secrets of the Sociobiome, where she really, really talks about how all of this is tied together, the ecosystem of the soil and the biology and the insects and the birds, how that all fits together into this, what she calls the socio biome. And it's really, really interesting. So we're going to watch a clip, I believe, maybe 20
Yep.
minutes or so,
Yep.
Lynette. But I would encourage each of you, if you haven't seen it, it's on our YouTube channel. It's all free. You should watch all four of them, but for sure watch the rest of this one.
Yeah.
And then you can go in. There's one that's specific to nitrogen. There's one that's going to be specific to phosphorus and how those cycle through the system and how we are just adding way too much of that stuff in our conventional farming systems. And then the third one is, I think, more on orchards and vineyards and perennial type settings. So lots of good information out there. Dr. Jones is a real treasure. She retired a few years ago, and so we have not seen new information from her. But as I was listening to this in preparation, it just reminded me maybe I don't really need no information because I don't remember all the old stuff that she said. So,
Right.
so reruns aren't always all that bad because you can still pick up lots of good nuggets of information. So as we're watching this, please take notes.
Mhm.
Please ask questions.
Yeah.
Please have comments or thoughts because this isn't just strictly a Q&A. I look at it as a bit more of a discussion. So would love to just hear other people's observations or comments as well as questions.
Perfect. Yeah. Here we go. Let's see if we can get this to share. Hmm.
Think about it.
Sorry.
But what we do know about plants now with the technology that we do have and the fact that we're able to interpret some of these signals is that plants function at their best when there is many different kinds of microbes living around their roots. And the best way to achieve that is by having many different kinds of plants growing together. Because when we have them, every kind of plant is obviously supporting different kinds of microbes. And when we have the plants growing together, actually, we want root mingling. In other words, we want the roots to be mingled in the soil. They don't necessarily have to be touching each other, but the plants have to be close enough for the mycorrhizal fungi to be able to link them together in a common mycorrhizal network. And even though there are plants that are not mycorrhizal, like brassicas, for example, provided they're in a mix with other kinds of plants that are mycorrhizal, they don't contribute to it, they are still part of it and they're still joined to the other plants through that network. So what effect does this root mingling of different plant species have on plant productivity, on immunity to pests and diseases, on tolerance to stress like droughts or waterlogging? As I mentioned before, here in Australia, we had massive droughts and now we're underwater and there's houses floating away and cattle floating away, and but the things that live in the soil have to deal with all these stresses, and these things come around in a cyclical nature all around the world. That there's always various stresses that environmental stresses that plants have to deal with and microbes have to deal with as well. So given that plants are in an environment that can be quite harsh at times, and given that we expect our plants to be productive, we want to be able to harvest them or we want to be able to graze them, it's very important to know what effect root mingling or the sharing of the sociobiome actually has on those functions. So in this diagram here, I know it looks rather busy, and that's because I guess they're trying to put the plants a little bit in the background and bring the microbes to the foreground. On the left-hand side, we have a bean plant, and on the right-hand side, we have a rice plant. So one is in the Fabaceae family and one is in the Poaceae family. And to get the maximum benefit from root mingling, we really want our plants to be in different families. So when I talk about putting different kinds of plants together, I mean plants that have got different functional traits or come from different plant families. So for example, if you wanted to put 6 different kinds of plants together, there's not a huge amount of benefit of putting 6 different grasses together. If you could put plants from 6 different plant families, then that's going to be much more beneficial. So, sorry, I just have to. These days when I'm not doing so many workshops and things, I don't get to use my voice a lot. So on the left-hand side, we have our bean plant. And you can see that there's a whole lot of microbes around the roots, and they're obviously the rhizosphere microbiome. There's also microbes all over the plant, on the leaves and the stems and the flowers and the fruits, and they're that's the phyllosphere microbiome. And then we have the endophytic microbiome, which is all the microbes that are actually inside the plant, the endophytes. And the more we look at these microbial interactions, the more we realise how important endophytes are. And most of the endophytes that are in the plant have actually come from the soil. So the plant has taken them up from the soil for some reason, for something that the plant needs. And quite often that could be to help the plant to deal with the nutritional stress of some kind or to deal with an environmental stress of some kind. It will take from the soil sociobiome, if you like, what it needs. Now, if we have different kinds of plants growing in close enough proximity for them to be able to share those microbes, what we will find is if there's different kinds of microbes under one kind of plant that aren't under the other or aren't in association with the other kind of plant, if they are able to mingle their roots or if they're able to be joined by a common mycorrhizal network, they're actually able to use the genetic material from another plant. So the microbes that are living in association with plants are able to the genetic material that's in those microbes is able to be used by the plants for stress tolerance and also for the acquisition of nutrients. So plant productivity is very much influenced by diversity, by the biodiversity of the microbiome. So if we have 2 plants the same, for example, 2 corn plants or 2 wheat plants growing side by side, they're going to have very similar microbiomes. In fact, probably going to have identical microbiomes, and that's going to have a negative feedback effect on plant productivity. The microbiome is going to be able to detect that the microbiome that's next to it or near it is the same as itself, and therefore it is a competitor. The microbiome is what will detect that this is competition. It's not the plant detecting that there's another plant it's competing with, it's the microbiome detecting there is another microbiome that it's competing with, and it basically won't cooperate, won't share resources. If we have dissimilar microbiomes next to each other, so we have plants from different plant families next to each other, and there are 6 or 8 plant families that are quite commonly used in agriculture. There's no reason why you can't have 6 or 8 plant families together. That will have a positive feedback effect on plant productivity. And you'd wonder, well, why would that be, that the microbiome, when it detects that other microbiomes in its vicinity are dissimilar, why would it be that it will actually cooperate rather than refuse to cooperate? You know, why does it cause that change? It's a change in behaviour by the dissimilarity. The more dissimilar they are, the more they will cooperate. And this is because if we think of a diverse plant community like a native prairie or something like that, where we have lots of different kinds of plants growing together, they will have different functional traits. In other words, they will respond to different environmental stimuli. Some may grow well when it's hot, some may grow well when it's cold, some may prefer it when there's lots of soil moisture, others could be very drought tolerant. And that means that at some time of the year, almost any time of the year, there will be something that is able to grow. And if there is something in that plant community that is able to grow at most times of the year, and all the plants are connected underground by a common mycorrhizal network, as well as other networks. That's the one that we're most familiar with, but we now know that there's a lot of networking going on in the soil. Then it means that there is energy coming into that microbial network continuously year round. If you only have one kind of plant there, it's only going to grow productively at one time of the year or under one set of environmental conditions. And for the rest of the year, the microbes in the soil basically starve. So it is to the benefit of the soil microbial community to have as many different kinds of plants there as possible. And the microbial community at some level is able to detect that. And if the microbial community detects that there is a lot of difference between the plants, in other words, the plants have dissimilar microbiomes, they're using dissimilar chemical messages, then the microbes cooperate and they have a positive feedback effect and they actually support each other. And this cooperation between the microbiomes, not between the plants microbiomes actually has an effect on plant productivity. Just jumped over a slide and I'm not really sure how to go back. I'm not having much luck with my techniques today. So I have mentioned this Yana biodiversity experiment many, many times before because it's probably the classic biodiversity experiment. It's run for at least 15 years in Eastern Germany. And in this experiment, they had 4 functional groups of plants. So they had grasses, legumes, tall herbs, and short herbs. So it's 2 different kinds of non-leguminous herbs. I think it's really important to get away from just grasses and legumes when we're looking at our mixes. And they had 1, 2, 4, 8, or 16 different plant species, but remember that's 4 functional groups. So if they had 16 plants, well, let's say if they had 8 plants, they didn't just have 8 different grasses or 8 different legumes. There was 4 functional groups in there. So there would have been 2 species from each of 4 functional groups. And I think it's the 4 functional groups that's more important than the 8 species. And they looked at biomass production and beneficial insects and microbial activity and water balance and carbon and nitrogen and phosphorus. And there's been hundreds of papers written out of this experiment. But this is just an overview of the site. You'll notice that there's a river, the Yana River, just running around the back of this experimental area here, and I'll mention why that's important in a minute. But what they found is that when they had, as the numbers of species went up in their experiments, that they actually had a linear response in terms of plant biomass. So this is 1 species, 2 species, 4, 8, or 16. And remember, where you've got 4 species, they're from 4 different plant families. Where you've got 8, they're from 4 different functional groups, not just 8 of the one kind of thing. And we've got this linear response. So the more and more diversity, the more functional diversity we have, the greater the biomass. And that's going to be really important for a whole lot of reasons. Doesn't matter whether it's crop biomass or whether it's pasture biomass, or even if you're just growing cover crop for soil protection or for feeding the soil microbiome. The more biomass you have, the more photosynthesis you're going to have, and the more that fungal energy channel is going to open. And in fact, it has been shown that there is a direct relationship between plant diversity and soil fungi. So forget all the stuff about fungal to bacterial ratios of 1 to 1 or whatever people talk about. You actually want them to be a lot more than 1 to 1. And the way to open that fungal energy channel is through plant diversity. So over here on the left, we have just plants of 2 different functional groups. So it could be a grass and a legume, for example. You will only ever be able to build soil to a certain depth with that limited amount of diversity. Over here, where we have 4 functional groups and 8 species, they're able to build, this community is able to build much deeper soil because these microbiomes are actually cooperating. And this deeper soil proved to be very beneficial when that river did flood and the whole experiment went underwater. And it was sitting in water for, there's several feet of water there. It was sitting in there for several weeks. And the scientists thought that the entire experiment was going to be destroyed. But they found that the The mixes that had the high diversity survived perfectly well, the waterlogging, whereas the monocultures didn't. And the other side of that coin is that drought tolerance is much, much higher, where we have high diversity in terms of a lot of different functional groups. Again, your 4 functional groups. So what happens when plants are in diverse communities is that they can respond to the drought by recruiting microbes from the microbiomes of dissimilar plants. This is where your dissimilarity becomes really, really important in extremes of, in climatic extremes. This is where diversity really comes to the fore. Because, for example, in a drought situation, you may have a plant that, a species that of its own is not really very drought tolerant, but if it's growing next door to something that does have better drought tolerance, it's able to recruit microbes from beneath that other plant. And when those microbes come as endophytes, they're taken up through the roots and they move into the plant, actually living inside the plant, so the plant has to feed them. So it means it has to photosynthesize more and produce more energy to actually, like, these have become borders or lodges, if you like, within the plant, and the plant is feeding those microbes. It's not going to do that unless it has a benefit from them being there. And those microbes will be able to bring about physiological changes within that plant that the plant's not able to bring about itself. For example, just produce enzymes or something that might thicken cell walls, reduce the amount of moisture that's lost through transpiration, and those kinds of benefits. There's a lot of literature on this, on how endophytes, beneficial endophytes, can actually provide drought tolerance to plants. So it's not a genetic thing, it's a microbial thing. And it comes, again, through diversity, through the sharing of this rhizosphere microbiome, and we need to have root mingling for that to happen. So the higher productivity that we see in diverse plant communities is due to a whole lot of different factors. As Noah mentioned before, it's like a jigsaw puzzle. We need to put all the different things together. You can't say it's just any one thing. For a start, if we have lots of different families of plants, then we're going to have variation in leaf architecture. Some things like the grasses, for example, are just going to have fairly narrow leaves sitting at, say, a 45-degree angle, but really don't catch a lot of light. Other things like sunflowers are going to have, big wide open leaves that do collect a lot of light. So this variation in leaf architecture results in more light interception, and that means that photosynthesis is going to be proceeding at a higher rate. We have a higher photosynthetic capacity, which means there is going to be more carbon exuded into the soil, and more exudates means more microbes, and more microbes is access to a larger gene pool. So when I say more microbes, I mean more different kinds of microbes, because we have different kinds of plants. And then that's very important for soil structure, for aggregate formation, because different kinds of bacteria and fungi and plant roots and plant root exudates and everything work together in a coordinated way to actually form aggregates. Nitrogen fixing, which I'm going to talk about, I'm talking about free living nitrogen fixing, and I'm going to talk about that in more detail in a couple of weeks' time. Disease resistance, frost drought, and flood tolerance. All of these things come through microbial diversity, which in turn comes through plant community diversity. And these diverse systems are self-organising. So the microbes actually know what to do. And they know what to do because they have such complex signalling mechanisms that we're only just starting to figure out actually how this signalling works, and how microbes produce these different signals, how they respond to them, how they know which ones to respond to. So yes, it really is a very, very complex world under our feet, but it is a very, very well organised world. So just to give you one example of, I was saying that there's a whole lot of different levels of interaction. There's the interactions that we're most commonly, that are most commonly spoken about, or that we've been aware of for the longest time, have been the interactions between plants and microbes. We know that plants produce signals that stimulate various microbes, and they stimulate microbes that they need for certain purposes. Microbes also produce signals that can have either positive or negative effects on plants. So it can work both ways. And microbes also produce signals that can have positive or negative effects on other microbes. So we have all these levels of conversation going on. And I just wanted to give you one example. I think I may have mentioned this before in other webinars, but I haven't spoken about it recently. But it's the networking that goes on between trees in a forest, which is often attributed to the trees themselves, but it has nothing to do with the trees really, other than the fact that they're photosynthesizing, and it has everything to do with the common mycorrhizal network. So this is one example here of we have a paper birch on the left-hand side and a Douglas fir on the right-hand side. The Douglas fir, you'd be more familiar with these trees than I am, these Northern Hemisphere trees, but the Douglas fir is going to remain evergreen. It's going to be able to photosynthesize at various levels throughout the year. Over on the left-hand side, we have a paper birch, which is going to lose its leaves in winter. Now, these trees are joined underground by a common mycorrhizal network, and the fungal network in the soil is receiving all of its energy from photosynthesis. So in summertime, when the paper birch has got leaves that capture a lot more light than the Douglas fir, most of the energy coming into the system is actually going to be from the paper birch. But the fungal network is channeling energy to this, in this case, a seedling of a Douglas fir, which is being shadowed by the paper birch in the summertime when it has leaves. So the seedling of the Douglas fir wouldn't be able to survive in the summertime because there wouldn't be enough light unless the fungal network kept it alive. And this is often attributed to the tree actually being very benign and keeping another tree of another species alive. But it is the fungal network that is keeping a tree of another species alive. So why should the fungal network care whether a Douglas fir seedling survived or not? Well, it's going to care because in wintertime, when the paper birch doesn't have any leaves and it's not photosynthesizing, the only energy that can come into that common mycorrhizal network is going to be from Douglas fir, which are photosynthesizing over winter. So it's a very simple example of just two species, but to show you the incredible power of the common mycorrhizal network and why the common mycorrhizal network actually behaves in that way, because it is to the benefit of the microbes to keep as many different kinds of plants alive, because that is going to ensure that there's going to be energy coming into the system for as many parts of the year as possible. So when you ask the question, who is directing traffic here, it is actually the microbes that are controlling what's going on, even though we look at those trees, like absolutely huge trees, and the energy that's moving around in the soil under those trees is being directed by microbes. So that was really all I wanted to say about soil sociobiome, because the chemistry of it can get incredibly complex. I guess if we look at things like insects, we probably see that there's extraordinary chemical signaling going on between insects and plants and insects and insects and other insects. I mean, isn't it amazing how pollinators
Amazing. Wow.
A lot of good stuff there.
There really is. Every time I watch it, it seems like I pick up just a little bit more. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's see, do we have questions coming in here yet?
In here real quick. Can you slide down? A lot of people introducing. We have people from all over the place. Let me see if there's any questions yet. Doesn't look like there's any questions yet. Oh, wait, here's
Looks
one.
like Dan,
For
yeah, Dan has
examples,
a question there.
yeah, Dan does. For examples, are forb to forb and tree to tree. Are there tree to forb interactions as well?
You know, I doubt it. And the reason that I say that, I can't say 100% sure yes or no, but the reason that I say probably not is because from what my understanding, or I'll do what John Kemp says. My current understanding is because we're always learning new things. And so my current understanding is that there's two types of these mycorrhizal networks, or there's two types of mycorrhiza, if you will. One is the ectomycorrhiza, ECTO, and those are the ones like in that last example with the paper birch and the pine tree. The ectomycorrhiza typically are what is colonizing trees and woody shrubs, and they're very effective at tying them all together and having the sharing of what was being seen there. The network of mycorrhiza that is going to colonize, a cover crop mix or our plant species, the more herbaceous type things, are endomycorrhiza. And again, it's a different type or a different family of mycorrhiza fungi. And when you go to purchase, if you're going to apply the spores or the seeds out there, if you will, of the mycorrhiza fungi, those are specifically different types that you would buy. And so my guess is that you don't see a lot of crossover between the two. Now, is there benefits of having them mixed together? Absolutely, there would be, because there's still going to be sharing of other microbial benefits, other nutrient cycling benefits. So there's certainly going to be benefits. And great examples of this would be, we work a lot with growers in California who are growing almonds or pistachios or walnuts or grapevines, all of which are going to primarily have that ectomycorrhiza fungal network. But we plant very diverse cover crop species mixes in between those rows every fall, and they grow through the winter and into the spring. And even though those networks aren't likely connected to where there's that direct transfer, that direct sharing of nutrients or information like what Dr. Jones was talking about here, there's still a tremendous amount of benefit from the nutrient cycling, from the benefit of having all of these pollinator support, again, like what she was showing there. So there's a tremendous amount of benefits that still accrue by having that diversity within that system. I just don't know that they're necessarily tied together in that same type of network as what she was demonstrating there.
Very good. Another question. I'm curious your thoughts on her comments on the Douglas fir with the green avalanche or the cedar. Could this be part of a loss of C3 grasses or other cool season plants that could be helping to feed the pasture during the dormant season?
So the question is mostly on the cedar encroachment. Is that right?
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, you know, as with anything, too much of a good thing be, becomes out of balance, and it no longer becomes a good thing. And so, having the occasional tree here and there, or having the shelter belts of trees, all great things. But with the cedar and how it spreads, and the birds spread it, and it becomes an invasive weed then at that point. And it no longer is growing in a diverse ecosystem, because once those things take over, it's pretty much just cedars and nothing else. Doesn't allow, a diverse cover crop mix. Like if we had them in nice rows, like silvopasture can work very well in the right situations where you have rows of trees that are producing either fruit or nuts or some type of high protein pods that are going to drop, and you can graze those with your cattle. And then you can plant things. Some guys are growing crops between those rows of trees, oats or barley that they harvest for grain, or they may just be growing a forage crop that they would graze in addition to whatever those trees are producing. But that has to be when those trees are in rows and you've got, the solar corridors for your plants to grow in. And when those cedars encroach, they're just all over the place and they're just going to choke out everything. And so that's where, what could be a good thing for a shelter belt or for other environmental benefits there, it just gets out of control and it truly becomes a weed then at that point that is no longer providing environmental services, but is just something that you're going to have to spend money on controlling and managing. Otherwise, it's just going to get away from you and be a real issue. And yes, they will definitely choke out C3 grasses, C4 grasses, both cool season and warm season, because just nothing's going to grow underneath that cedar tree.
Ben says that apples are endomycorrhizal and alders can tie into both endo and ectro.
Okay, well,
Yeah. And then, yeah, go ahead.
yeah, the beauty of plants and the way God created things to work together never ceases to amaze me. So that's wonderful.
Yeah. And how close and or far away can we plant the 4 intercrop cover crop families into the cash crop and not lose yield on the cash crop? More a function of harvest mechanics and shade.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it really depends on the cash crop. So, for example, corn is very, very sensitive to any competition early on in its life, because that corn is setting all its genetic markers, the length of the cob and the how many rows around it is and the depth of the kernel. A lot of those things, those genetic potentials are being set at very early stages of that plant growth. And if that corn senses that competition from other plants, or like Dr. Jones was saying, it's more likely it's not just the plant, it's that plant's microbiome is sensing other microbiomes, then it kind of pulls back its genetic potential and you never can recover that. You never get that back. And so with corn, you can do some cool cover cropping or intercropping type things with it. You just have to be careful that you don't do it too early or you'll hurt your yield potential. Uh, if you spread your rows out, so instead of doing 30-inch row corn, we now do 60-inch. Well, now I can push that a little bit more because I can grow more because it's not right up against that little corn plant isn't sensing something that's 30 inches away, but it can certainly sense something that's 5 inches away. And so, the context there varies a little bit. Typically with corn, what we have seen, if we wait until your V2 or V3, so the second or third leaf stage of corn, we can plant our cover crop, and the diversity that we would add there is we would do some legumes, like cowpeas or uh, faba beans or mung beans. We would do some brassicas like a radish or a mustard. And then, the other plant families are coming from things like buckwheat and flax and phacelia. Each of those are their own different plant families. So we can get all that diversity in there. But if we do V2 or V3 or later, we typically are just fine with corn. Soybeans and milo, not nearly as sensitive to that early competition. You can actually plant those all together, and it's not going to be a yield limiting competition like it is with corn. Now, if you get them too thick, then you certainly can hurt, your cash crop because now it's a competition for water, sunlight, and nutrients. And so you would still want to, the number one rule of companion cropping, intercropping is don't hurt your cash crop. Or at least if you're going to pull it back a little bit, you have to achieve enough additional benefits to offset that. So you still need to be smart in how you do that and not, you got to have the right species in the right balance at the right time. And so corn is probably the most sensitive. The other one's a little less. Sunflowers are a great one to have understory crops with because, harvest issues are another thing to consider. And with milo and soybeans, those are certainly issues. Sunflowers, you're typically harvesting high enough off the ground. You can have all kinds of stuff underneath those, and it typically isn't a huge issue there. We have people doing some things with wheat. And again, you can seed all these other plant families right with the wheat, winter wheat. So, we would do things like spring lentils, flax, radishes, any of those could be put out with the wheat in the fall. You're going to get some growth. You're going to get the benefits of that diversity in the fall. Those species are going to die through the winter, and then you have that wheat able to grow without that competition, without the threat of having harvest issues. Now, you could have some red clover, yellow blossom clover, something like that in there, and it would overwinter and have something still growing underneath. But for the most part, we would take our diversity benefits up front and then not have to worry about the harvest issues on the backside on something like that. So, there's lots of, like everything, it really depends on the context, and you just have to be intentionally smart about how you do that. And then, that's with interseeding, but if you're doing polycropping, where you're actually growing multiple things together and harvesting them all at the same time, it's kind of a different set of rules that apply there then. And so if you're growing cereal rye and hairy vetch, for example, they would grow very well together, and you could harvest the seed of both of those. Oats and peas do really well together. For our friends further north, are doing a lot of peas and canola or mustard and canola. So there's different ways you can do that. And again, you would need to have the right species in the right balance. And in this case, the timing has to be very similar because you're going to plant those at the same time, most likely. But there you have to have the right balance in order to do that. And then you have to be able to separate them unless you're just feeding the whole thing as livestock feed.
And what about with mixed vegetables like broccoli? We interplant a row of radish or salad and radish down middle or of two rows of broccoli. So technically, same plant families, so same microbes will create negative effect potentially.
Yeah, potentially you certainly could. If you're doing mixed vegetables, I mean, I think it's going to definitely be better to if you've got two different brassica crops, yeah, I would separate them with a legume in the middle there, just to get that, the root mingling, as Dr. Jones talks about. And it's really interesting because, we typically think of that competition mechanism within plants because the plants are looking at each other and going, it's too crowded in here, or, there's not enough water for all of us, or whatever it is. But, what she's saying, and this is really interesting, I think, is that competition mechanism is triggered more by the microbiomes than by the plants themselves. And it's triggered when the microbiomes are very similar. And so that's why the absolute most competitive environment any plant can be in is in a monoculture because the microbiomes of all those plants are exactly the same. Uh, the second most is where you have two different plants growing together and they're from the same plant family. So, if you had corn out there, we wouldn't want to use sorghum sudan as our companion crop, really, because now we've got very similar plant families. We're still going to have that, similar microbiomes butting heads. But when we swap that out and we do a pea or a cowpea or a radish or collard or buckwheat, now we've got very dissimilar plants, dissimilar microbiomes, and then it's not nearly as competitive. So yes, I would not plant my brassicas all together. The more that you can kind of intersperse those, a row of this, a row of that, a row of something else, the better off you're going to be. And if you're doing it in a garden, where it's mostly being done by hand anyway, then why not? When you're doing it out in a big field and you're relying on equipment and mechanical considerations, that makes it much more difficult to have, this checkerboard of all these different things growing out there.
And Michelle said that I do dill or such in brassicas. That's a good idea.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. I,
that makes
di-
sense.
I,
Those
I
herbs
love
that
dill.
you
So,
talked about,
so
right? Yeah.
dill, yeah, dill and coriander or cilantro, the plant is coriander when it's growing, cilantro, I guess, when you put it on a taco. Same plant. Those are both in the carrot family, the Apiceae family. And we've had them both in our test plots, and we've really liked what they've done. And so we started looking because, typically, these herb type things are kind of expensive seed. But we started looking, and it's amazing what people are growing out there. And we found lots of seeds. So we've got, I don't know, I think we got like 30,000 pounds of dill and 30,000 pounds of coriander this year. So we're going to what used to be so expensive that we could only put it a little bit, in our pollinator mixes or a little bit in our garden type mixes. Well, now I think we've got it affordable enough, and it's small seed. It doesn't need a lot. We're going to start putting that in the broadacre mixes, half a pound of dill, half a pound of coriander in these broadacre mixes because, again, it can bring that diversity across all those acres instead of just in kind of a little specialty strip. So we're excited about that.
Yeah, and different plant families, right? Just like she talked about. Yeah, those tall
Mhm.
herbs and those short herbs. Yeah. Let's see. Hillary has a question here. How do I apply this thinking and understanding to weed management? If you have pastures being overtaken by a certain weed like Canadian thistle or knapweed, would planting more diverse plant families address this issue?
Well, yeah, that's a great question, Hillary. And I think, the way that we would look at this then is, you know, with based on what Dr. Jones said, if we want to be more competitive with that weed, we want to have our cover crop or our forage crop or our cash crop to be as similar to that weed as possible, so that our microbiomes are similar, and then it kind of antagonizes that instead of saying, oh, join us over here, let's all cooperate. So, Canadian thistle is a good example. Canadian thistle is in the Asteraceae family, the daisy family. And so we could do things like sunflowers, safflower, chicory. All three of those are in that same plant family. And I'm not saying that if you go out and plant sunflowers, all your Canadian thistles are going to disappear. Uh, but typically what we have seen is it will help with that. And there's a lot of things around timing and things like that as well. But as a general rule, your weeds are going to be um, best competed with by a cover crop or a cash crop or a forage crop that's most similar to that weed. So, there's great resources out there, and I know part of the title of this webinar is, what are these weeds telling you about your soils? And I do think weeds are tremendous diagnostic tools of what's going on in your soil. And I would just really encourage you, if you haven't read, When Weeds Talk by Jay, is it McCammon, I think. There's two or three really good books out there. And I think a lot of them are free on the internet, or they're not. I shouldn't say that. I think they are, but there's good resources out there that have great documentation of, okay, if you see a lot of this showing up, well, then it's probably this, and then you can deal with the weeds on a couple of levels. One would be to utilize cover crops that are very similar. But the other one would be, if that weed is showing up because of a nutrient either deficiency or something is out of balance, there's too much of it. So like pigweeds, for example, thrive where you have high levels of nitrates. Well, then, once you understand what that weed is telling you, hey, you've got a lot of nitrates out here. I'm going to help you get it taken up and utilized. Well, then you need to figure out then how to change, that nutrition environment to where it disfavors the weeds that you're fighting and favors the cash crop that you're going to be doing. So those are things that, we like to think about when it comes to trying to compete with weeds, with cover crops and with nutrition.
Yeah, that's what I always think about too. I always think about what is the weed trying to tell me? Am I deficient or is there a compaction issue or something? And how do I support it? How do I help it along?
Yeah, and
Yeah.
and here's I here's a little something that I've started doing. I haven't done this for the weed thing yet, but I need to and I want to. So, lots of people have different opinions on AI, but AI is a wonderful tool for helping you sift through vast amounts of information. And rather than just going to Chat GPT and just saying, what does it mean when I have a bunch of dandelions in my soil? A much better way to do that is if you can find these resources, and maybe it's a webinar that somebody did that, talks about, how weeds are telling you things about your soil. Find out information that you can and load it into a chat or into an AI project of some sort, and then ask that specific question because the first thing then it looks at is all the materials that you've loaded in there. And that's typically going to get you much better, much more accurate results than when you just have AI go out and search the internet. You'll get varied results with that. Sometimes you'll get good information. Other times it's like, I don't know if that's really right. And sometimes you may think it's right, but it's not. So you always need to be double checking that. But that's one of the best uses of AI is to feed it a whole bunch of information, then ask some specific questions about, what does it mean when this is happening? And it does a really good job of searching all the literature that you've told it to look at.
Nice. Nice. Yeah. You don't get the typical answer, right? Because you choose the resources. That makes a big
Yeah.
difference. Yeah. So Dan would like to know, so when it comes to levels of diversity, right, and you're just beginning as a cover cropper, what do you recommend? Do you recommend a real high diverse mix, or do you just recommend start with a few things? What are your thoughts?
Well, again, it really depends on the context. The first thing, before we even talk about diversity, we would want to know what are you trying to accomplish?
Mhm.
What are your goals, for using a cover crop? And if you don't really know the answer to that, then we can't really even go to the diversity question until we know that. So, we need to know, are you trying to produce supplemental grazing for your cattle? Are you trying to produce nitrogen for your next cash crop? Do you have an erosion issue? Is there compaction that you're worried about that you're trying to address? Are you looking to supplement your, beneficial insect population? So lots of different things that cover crops can do. It can't do everything, or at least it can't do everything really well. So we want to be able to zone in and focus in on, the two, three, four things that are really important to you. And then once you have those determined, then we're also going to need to know what time of the year are you planting it, because spring, summer, fall is going to again really make a big difference on what species that we can do within that, because they have to be able to grow for enough of a period of time to make them worthwhile. So we can't be planting a warm season plant in South Dakota in October and expecting very, very much good to happen from there. So we would want to know the answers to those questions, and then we can start talking about how much diversity do we want to have out there. And probably the other thing, Lynette, that would be really important is how are you going to terminate it?
Yeah.
Because sometimes adding too much diversity can really cause issues with termination
Mhm.
if you are, for example, trying to roller crimp it.
Yeah.
Roller crimping can work really well, but you have to have the plants at the right growth stage.
Oh,
And
that's
so
right.
roller crimping typically works better with low diversity mixes because I can kind of get everything at the same growth stage versus a very highly diverse mix where I'm going to do a good job crimping some things and other things won't even know it happened.
Yeah. Yeah.
So those are all things that we would look at in conjunction with how much diversity. So once you kind of know all those things, then we would want to put in as much diversity as makes sense
Yeah.
for the answers or the context that the answers to those other questions develop for us. Um, we would still always want to try to have four plant families,
Yeah.
and to us that's uh, we always were kind of bragging, yeah, we had 12 different species in here. And again, Dr. Jones, she when she comes out, she can kind of humble you sometimes because she's like, well, how many plant families? And we're like, I don't know. What are the plant family? So we didn't even know. And so we had to go and learn. We had to go and learn those things.
Mhm.
And every single legume that you have, that's all one plant family. Every grass that there is, that's a second plant family, and all the brassicas, a third plant family. So we could have a 12 species mix and only have three plant families. And that's just not very good.
Yep.
It's only when you get into the what we call the other broadleaf category, that's where you start to see lots of diversity. So sunflowers and safflower, that's in a different plant family than what flax is, and that's different than what buckwheat is, and that's different than what phacelia is, and
Mm.
that's going to be different than what the dill and the coriander are. And so it's the cucurbit mix that we have, each one of those. So, I think we have a mix now, one of our pre-made mixes. I can't remember if we're calling it family. I think it's called the family reunion mix.
Oh, nice.
And I think it does have 7 or 8 plant families in it. I made a mix for Rick Clark, and we called it the Archie Bunker mix. And only old people like us
Nope,
even know,
exactly.
Archie Bunker was all in the family. The young people, you have to explain that to.
Yeah, yeah.
But again, it had, 8 to 9 different plant families in it. And he loves that mix because
Mm.
it's not always the biggest biomass, but he always sees the biggest benefits.
Wow, that's a cool
So
one.
for a beginner,
Yep.
I would want to have a minimum of 4 plant families if it makes sense.
Yeah.
Now, again, when we plant, if we have a late harvest in Nebraska and I'm not planting until November,
Mm.
well, guess what? I might just be planting monoculture rye, and that's okay because that's a whole lot better than nothing.
That's right. You're covering, right?
But if I'm planting that in early September, well, then I'm for sure having, I'm going to throw a little flax in there. I'm going to throw some rapeseed in there. I'm going to have some winter peas or some vetch so don't don't throw money away just so you can brag about how many species you had at the coffee shop. Don't put it in there if it doesn't make sense. It has to make sense.
Hmm.
But when it does make sense, put it in there.
Yeah. Can you speak to the means of planting diverse plant families into existing pastures? How long must you give it to establish before you graze it? This is from Jill.
Yeah. Well, Jill, there's a couple things to think about here. Number one is it's really hard to get new things started in existing perennial stands. And so if you have a really good stand, in fact, I was on the way up here to Omaha, where I'm at right now. I was talking to a customer who from Arkansas who's wanting to get additional hay production out of his Bermuda and crabgrass perennial pastures or perennial Bermuda and crabgrass that comes back every year. And I said, well, the only way that we're going to do that is we have to have cool season things going. Because once that Bermuda wakes up, it's well established, it's deep rooted, it's very aggressive. It's probably just going to choke everything else out. And so if we're going to get you some additional forage out there, then we need to be going in there right now with cool season things, oats, peas, safflower, collards. We can get that stuff to grow right now, and then you can have most of that grazed off, hayed off before the Bermuda ever wakes up. So that'd be the first thing to think about is in your existing perennial pastures, you really have to think about whatever you're going to try to establish has to be established in a period where the existing stuff is not actively aggressively growing. And that's either in the off season, like a cool season, warm season, off season type thing, or you have put the perennial to some sort of a disadvantage, either through, I mean, some people will even do a light tillage or, just really grub it down hard with a grazing much harder than what you normally would. But somehow you have to give that new planting a chance. Now, if your question is new establishment, so there's nothing out there, we're taking crop ground and we're going to perennials, then that's a little bit different story. Typically with cool season introduced, we could plant that in the fall. I prefer planting those in the fall, late summer, fall, and so like things like fescue and orchard grass and brome and clovers and alfalfa, chicory, plantain. I like planting those when most people would plant alfalfa. So here in Nebraska, that would be late August, early September. As you go north or south, you can adjust that a little bit. And typically, if you can get it established in the fall, you can probably get one light grazing late that next spring. Don't graze it hard, but you can graze it a little bit. And then you might, depending on how much rainfall you get, you might be able to get some grazing then that fall as well. If you get some regrowth, and then certainly then that next year you're probably up and running really well. If you're doing more warm season or native type things, we've seen where that takes 2 to 3 years before you really have a lot of stand there. So kind of depends on what you're doing, but uh, use your best judgment. If there's some out there, you could go out and do a light grazing, but certainly don't risk the investment that you made in planting that by grubbing it into the ground.
Yeah, we got another question here. Let's see if I can get it back. Sorry. Jillian would like to know, for producers working to increase native plant diversity on degraded rangelands, what seed mix would you recommend to provide it a regenerative jump start?
Well, a couple schools of thought here. Um, one would be that you probably have the seeds. If it's been rangeland, you probably have the seed bank of all your native stuff already there. And so, which is great because that seed's really expensive. So, what we would like to see people do, especially if it's really degraded, don't spend a bunch of money on expensive perennials. Figure out what your windows of opportunity are to plant less expensive annuals. So, really diverse annual mixes. Again, in the spring, it would be, oats, peas, turnips, collards, safflower, rapeseed, things like that. In the summertime, you could do sorghums, millets, cowpeas, mung beans, flax, buckwheat, lots of things like that. So there's lots of choices, but figure out where your windows of opportunity are to get those things planted. And then probably what I would do on that is I would let it grow as much as I could, and I would graze it one time, and I would graze it pretty hard to, kind of emulate that, buffalo stampede, that buffalo tromping type thing. And with enough animal impact, with enough of the dung and the urine getting stomped and tromped into the ground, that likely is going to start to trigger that will give the biological signals or indicators for your native seed that's in the seed bank to germinate and start to come. And you may need to do that a couple of years. But I would do that before I would be spending a lot of money, especially if you're trying to establish, more of a native type system. Now, if you're going to do a more of an introduced type pasture, again, the fescues, ryegrasses, bromes, clover, chicory, alfalfa, things like that, then again, I would plant those in the late summer, early fall to try to get those established. So again, it depends on what your goal is, but even in that situation, if it's really degraded, I would do at least 1 year, if not two, of just planting and grazing annuals because it's the cheapest way to build up your organic matter, to build up your soil structure, and to build up the biological community. So that now, when you go out and you spend the big money on trying to get perennials going, you've got something to start with. You're no longer starting in that really degraded soil. You're starting with something that the healing process has begun.
Very good. Wow. So many great questions. I think that's all of them for right now. So yeah, go ahead and type your question if you have questions in the Q&A. And yeah, I think, some things that I wanted to ask you a little bit about is, she talked about the 4 functional groups, of plants. And my understanding was it was grasses, legumes, and then the two types of herbs, the tall herbs and the short herbs. What is the difference between the tall herbs and the short herbs? Can you give some examples of those, or do you understand what she's talking about?
Well, we have to translate from Australian, I believe.
Exactly, exactly.
I think when she's saying herbs, I think she's referring primarily to forbs,
Okay,
which would be a broadleaf plant that's not a legume.
okay, okay.
That's kind of how we would describe that. So, we divide it up into, legumes, grasses, brassicas,
Okay.
and because those are all each individual families, and then all the other broadleaves. Now, within all those other broadleaves, you'd have taller ones, shorter ones, perennial ones, annual ones, cool season ones, warm season ones. So certainly those are each, you get that diversity by crossing all those families. I do think, and I have talked to Dr. Jones and others about this, and they would tend to agree that there is some value in having what I would call functional plant family decisions. So, in other words, a cool season legume and a warm season legume represents a lot more diversity than having two cool season legumes.
Mm.
And a cool season grass and a warm season grass would represent a lot more diversity than having two cools or two warms. Even though we haven't necessarily achieved a second plant family, functionally those are different. And a lot of it has to do with how they photosynthesize, with this, a C3 pathway versus a C4, but they function enough differently that I think you could look at that and go, yeah, I'm planting sorghum out here, but you know what? I don't think it would hurt if I had 8 to 10 pounds of oats with that, or maybe I got some volunteer rye coming back. Well, that's all good because now it's a different, what I would call a functional plant group.
Ah, I see.
So you can either try to design that into your mix, which it becomes more difficult when you're doing cool season, warm season the mixed mixes, because there's only certain times of the year when that kind of makes sense to do. But when you can do it, it's awesome. It's really, really good. So we would look at warm season, cool season of both the grasses and the legumes. Brassicas are all cool season, so that's really essentially all one functional plant family. And then as we jump into that other broadleaf category, certainly we're going to have warm season things like most of the things in the Asteraceae family, like sunflowers and safflower. Those are typically more warm season, although they're warm season because they handle the heat,
Mm.
but they also tolerate some cold weather. Frost isn't going to kill them. And so we start to see a little bit of blending on these.
Mm.
Safflower will handle temperatures, probably down into the upper teens, but it can also handle 100-degree heat in the summertime. So you start to get a lot wider spread of tolerances as you come to some of these. But there's still, some that would definitely be considered warm season and cool season. So again, we would just want to mix that up, have as much diversity out there as possible.
Mm.
And so, the tall herbs and the short herbs that she was talking about,
Yeah.
I would just liken that to, within that other broadleaf category, we have it's typically the warm season ones, sunflowers, okra. Okra is in its own plant family, same plant family as cotton, actually. That would be tall. Sesame, a different plant family, but it's going to be a tall plant. Whereas, your flax is going to be kind of a shorter one. Buckwheat is going to be kind of in the middle.
Hmm.
So, yeah, we just want to
Makes
be able
sense.
to
Yeah.
pull as much functional diversity as what makes sense.
Yeah, yeah. Another question, is it true that some plants don't have any mycorrhizal associations, but they have micro and other associations? Again, thinking about veggies.
Yeah. Well, I have to be careful here because I have said in the past, I have said, yes, absolutely that's true. And then I got corrected by someone smarter than me saying, well, not technically.
Hmm.
Um, so, so the things in the Brassica family, Typically, we don't see them associating with the mycorrhiza fungi. So your radishes, turnips, mustards, collards, kale, anything in that plant family really don't form those associations. And when I say that, this is where I got corrected. Somebody told me, well, that's true with arbuscular mycorrhiza fungi,
Okay.
but they said there are other types of mycorrhiza fungi that aren't arbuscular,
Mm.
and they can form associations with those. I'm like, I suppose I should learn more about that. And
Okay.
I think it has to do with, the arbuscular has that arbuscle that grows inside the plant root, and then the hyphae come out. And that's the one when we say mycorrhiza fungi, I think that's what most people are referring to. But there are other types of mycorrhiza that aren't arbuscular that can associate some with the Brassica family. So with that being said, we still we really would not ever want to see anybody for sure with a cover crop. You would never want to plant a brassica by itself for a couple reasons. Number one, you just have very little diversity, and it's probably going to suppress your arbuscular mycorrhiza populations. And that is the most important organism for growing these other crops. So we don't want to do that. Doesn't mean they can't be in the mix, but it means they can't be the majority of the mix. And the other thing is, I remember the first year, so 2008 was when Green Cover, we did our experiments with all these different cover crops, and we had the moisture sensors out there. And I remember distinctly that summer because we actually had some decent rain that year. And at that time, the radish was kind of that cool cover crop. Everybody said, "Oh, you plant radishes."
Mhm.
And so we planted all these strips, and then kind of on the end of the field, and we just planted, we had leftover radishes. We just planted solid radishes. We were so proud of that. I mean, these radishes, they were thick and they were green and they were big. And, they're those big ones that you take to the state fair because they look so nice. And, the cattle were eating them. And we just thought, man, we're really good farmers. That's pretty cool. Well, then guess what? Next spring came around, and that area was completely bare, completely bare because they did such a good job of cycling the nitrogen and the sulfur out of that soil that when they broke down, they took all of that wheat stubble with it. And that was just completely bare soil. And not to mention, we didn't even probably know about mycorrhiza at that time. So there's multiple bad things that happen when you go with a monoculture. And those are two of them that we saw right away is that we got our carbon nitrogen ratio way out of whack. And all of that beautiful wheat stubble that we need to grow a good corn crop the next year, it was gone. It's like, oh, can't do that again.
Yeah.
So yeah, you have to be careful. So I kind of got off track there a little bit. So that plant family does not have strong associations with our arbuscular mycorrhiza fungi. Neither does buckwheat. Now, buckwheat is not in the Brassica family. It's in the other broadleaf category. But for whatever reason, buckwheat does not form strong associations with the mycorrhiza. One of the best things that mycorrhiza does is it can get phosphorus out of the soil, the inorganic portion of phosphorus, which our soils almost all have lots of phosphorus in them, but plants can't get them. But buckwheat roots, because mycorrhiza are the best way to get phosphorus out of that mineral portion into your plants. Well, when a plant doesn't associate with mycorrhiza, it has to figure something else out. And plants are, pretty adaptive. God has built into them, mechanisms to do this. So the roots of buckwheat will exude pretty unique and relatively strong organic acids. And that acid is kind of doing the same thing that the mycorrhiza did. It can access that phosphorus that other plants cannot, can bring it into the plant. And so that's where you may have heard people say, well, I want to plant buckwheat because I want to make more phosphorus available. It's doing that because it doesn't associate very well with mycorrhiza. So it's had to come up with other mechanisms to get to the phosphorus. So to my knowledge, those are
Micros,
the
right?
main
Yeah.
ones
So
that
it's the
don't
micros,
associate
right?
with.
Yeah. Hmm.
Yeah, but certainly there would be tremendous other microbial benefits. It's just that arbuscular mycorrhiza fungi are not going to be strong within those two plant families.
Yeah. Yeah. And what about plants that utilize high nitrates? What do you suggest?
Uh, are you saying should we plant them? Should we not plant them? Or
I think she's trying to, yeah, I think this person is trying to utilize those high nitrates, right? Yeah.
yeah. Well, all plants need nitrogen to grow, and so they're all going to be pretty darn capable of soaking up your nitrates, some more than others. Again, radishes where they've got that big tuber, and that's the other thing. If you're growing radishes that are huge, you may brag about it, but now that I'm so much smarter than I used to be, I'll look at that and go, you had way too much carryover nitrogen in your field. That's not necessarily a good thing. So radishes are great for that. Basically, anything that's going to grow a lot of biomass is going to suck up a lot of nitrogen. Now, you have to be very, very careful because if you're doing that and you're trying to graze, you could have nitrate poisoning issues. And whereas prussic acid poisoning is pretty unique to the sorghum family, nitrate poisoning or nitrate toxicity, I mean, we've seen that in radishes, we've seen that in turnips, we've seen that in sorghum, we've seen that in oats. It can happen with many plants if you have way too high nitrates and then that plant gets really stressed for some reason, drought or frost or something else that stresses that plant. And so if you've got nitrogen that you need to cycle, then yeah, plant something that's going to grow a lot of biomass because now that nitrates can be spread out across all that biomass and it would become, something that may be grazable, but a lot of times what people would do is if you've got high nitrate forage, and it's a quick and easy and a cheap test to do, so you should always be doing it. If you have questions, you can blend that off, whether you're grinding hay or however you're doing that. But if you have excess nitrates out there, just by growing something and then letting it cycle back into the soil, you haven't necessarily solved the problem. You've just cycled it, and so you really need to have something that you can haul away. So either a grain crop or a forage crop where you can export some of that out and then figure out why you had such high nitrates and try to not do that again. So, whether it was an over application or you had a failed crop from the year before, that can certainly happen. Spreading too much, manure, things like that. Just try to understand how you got into that situation in the first place and then modify your future rotation or your future action so that doesn't happen.
Like that. Yeah. Yeah. And so what would the test be that you need? Is that something that you can just take a little bit of the forage and send off to a lab to do
Yep.
the
Yep.
test?
You just
Yeah.
you just send it into any lab,
Hmm.
and it's just a nitrate feed test.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's something like their extension office or somebody could help them with. Yeah.
Yes, for
Yeah.
sure.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Wow. We're getting close to time, believe it or not. Yeah. Any last thoughts that you have today, Keith? Yeah. Any last thoughts?
Well, just again, just listening to that segment from Dr. Jones, just it really it convinces me that even though we don't always do things right, I think we're on the right path as we continue to pursue diversity. And it's diversity at multiple levels. I
Mhm.
really liked how she brought out the point or the fact, when we go out and we look at a field, we see all this plant diversity, and so we just assume that that's what's, driving the bus. But her point was it's really the microbial diversity that is making the decisions, that's doing the communication, that's where the magic happens. But but those microbes cannot survive without a plant. And so that's where you absolutely have to have both. And the microbial diversity is going to be a reflection of the plant diversity. So I don't think we should waste any time asking about which one is more important because you can't have healthy soils without having both. And so you have to have the plant diversity, the richness of plants to get the richness of microbial. It's no different than in our own bodies, Lynette. You know, if we're going to have a healthy, balanced gut biome, you can't do that if you're a monoculture eater. You have to have a wide variety of things that you're eating in order to support a diverse, microbial gut population.
Yeah.
And, the system works very similar in the soil. So it just really struck me that it's important that we put as much plant diversity out there whenever we can, get the biological diversity out there. And there's a lot of debate about, should I be putting, biological products on the soil? Isn't it already out there? Well, maybe. It should be, but not always. Depends on how degraded, how abused, how badly we managed that in the past. And so certainly if you're planting a cover crop and you aren't putting a biological seed treatment on it, it's a big missed opportunity because that generally does not cost very much because you can only put so much on the seed
Mhm.
and you can add a lot of diversity right where it counts the most, which is right where that seed is going to grow.
Mhm.
And then, for the other things, the in-furrows and the foliar applications, I think there's a lot of benefit to some of that, but only if you're going to change the rest of your system. Those things are not going to work or not work very well. You're not going to see a good return on your investment if you're not changing other parts of the system. So you can't go out and spray a foliar biology on and then still be putting 200 units of nitrogen on your corn. I don't think you're going to see any benefit.
Yeah.
You've got to do
You've
it in
got to feed
conjunction
that
with pulling
biology,
back on
don't you? Yeah, you've got to feed
some of
that
the other
biology.
stuff.
You can put it there, right? But it's still got to be
Yeah,
fed. I mean, if you really want that
yeah,
biology to grow and yeah, and become native, right?
yeah.
Your field or your pasture, you're gonna have to feed it. Yeah.
Yeah. And so again, I commend, John Lundgren and Ecdysis for the Thousand Farms Initiative. I think it will continue to drive conversations. I think that's the type of stuff we need to continue to drive adoption. And I know some of the other exciting initiatives that are going to be coming up are going to continue that. But when you read that report, when you listen to him talk, the number one thing that he talks about and reports on is diversity.
Yeah.
And it just can't be overstated how important that is. So yeah, I would just encourage each one of us to, try to figure out how do we get more and more of that into our operations and how do we, utilize the power that brings.
Thank you so much. We are at the end of our time, and I so appreciate you, Keith, joining us and yeah, and being able to, yeah, work it into your schedule. I know how busy you are right now. But thank you for the conversation and just, yeah, all the knowledge that you have. We really appreciate you. Um,
Okay. Thank you, Lynette, and thanks everybody. Have a great rest of your day.
you bet. Bye-bye.